8 days in the non-Anglo-Saxon world, as it were. And it's always nice to feel like one came home. No matter how much anxiety I get in England, it's not half as much as anxiety as I get in France and Spain, so especially France, for some reason. Tonight, I'm going to depart from my usual format when I lecture in England, because I'm always told that I'm much too theoretical for such a pragmatic place. So tonight I'm going to merely show projects and describe some of the ideas as I go along, rather than to try and see it as an overview. The reason for that is that, quite frankly, in the last year, we've been involved in about 4 or 5 new major projects, which the theory for which sort of catches up with the projects as they go along. And I'd rather sort of go through this with you straight, rather than to build up any kind of really affected notion of what the real theory is, because the real theory is probably not known to me right now, to tell you the truth. One of the projects you're going to see tonight is even a project that's hardly known to me, and I haven't seen the slides. They've been done since I've been away this week, and so I'm going to try and explain a project to you that I think I know what it's about. At least I set up the ideas for it, and tells you something about what happens when you become a building architect. You try and stay ahead of the people in the office. I still have no anxiety about the fact that the idea structure is still there, and I think you'll recognize the work. Maybe you won't. I'm going to start by showing you first some slides of the Wexner Center for the Visual Arts at Ohio State, which is going to open this fall. I've got some slides that are first real construction shots of it that I have, and I'll briefly introduce that as a way of starting the talk. It's a project, don't forget, which is interesting, is 5 years old, almost 6 years old, and you have to realize how difficult it is to look at a project that you're finally completing and say, my God, those ideas are 6 years old. It's one of the kind of lags that you have when you start to build large-scale projects. The rest of the projects I'm going to show you are projects that have been done in the past year, and they move very quickly through a set of ideas that we're running through, and then 2 very recent projects which strike out some new ground again. And I'm not sure of the ground, and I'm going to share them with you tonight. Be interested to see your reaction to it. So we're going to take 3 stages of work. One, a set of work, the Ohio State project, which is from a previous sort of period of my own work. Then 3 projects which represent the last 2 years, and then 2 new projects which are the work that I'm just working on right now. So can we have the lights? Are we going to put the light? I think that happens. Oh.
That's the bottom line.
Just to go back, the slide on the left is the model of the Wexner Center for the Visual Arts in Columbus, Ohio. This did have it. Oh, yeah, I got it. This is a 3,000-seat existing auditorium, and this is a 700-seat existing auditorium. These two buildings were connected, and there was a competition for a new, basically, visual arts museum of art for the 21st century. And of course, it's very difficult to have art of the 21st century. Now, what's interesting about this competition, as another one that I'm going to show you, it was against, first of all, Michael Graves, and second of all, Caesar Pelli and Arthur Erickson. And when you're in these competitions, they're really high-stake poker games. And you really have to try and understand what the opposition is going to do before, in fact, you decide. Given the fact that these two buildings were connected, and of course Michael to this day keeps saying to me, Peter, how they ever let you blast a hole through there, I'll never know. It's through existing building. Michael has always wanted to do a palazzo, is doing one for the Whitney, and we knew that he was going to take a contextual site where he could do a palazzo, so he chose this site over here, which is the only contextual site to do a palazzo. So Michael's project was here. Caesar, so we couldn't go there. I mean, it was clear. Caesar Pelli was also going to do a palazzo, but he would do a modern palazzo, that is a non-contextual palazzo, and the only place that could be would be out here in this big oval space where there were no buildings around, where he could be right on the axis, which is what a palazzo would do, but it would have no context around it. In other words, no buildings at all. So Caesar took this site. Arthur Erickson, who doesn't understand competitions, likes to put his buildings in prominent places. We knew was going to do something down this axis here, which is precisely what he did. So that we knew that this site was taken, this site was taken, and this site was taken, and we really didn't leave very much, so we blasted through the existing building. And that doesn't tell you theoretically why we did it, but this is not going to be necessarily a theoretical discussion. Basically, what we did was to say that we didn't know what a building that housed 21st century art would be about, and so that we would essentially erect a scaffolding waiting for a building to be built. So this scaffolding was essentially a spine which ran through, allowed students to move north-south along the asymptote of this axis of this oval, and east-west, cutting through the building. In other words, you could walk through the building without ever entering the building, and allowed for the town grid, which was at a 12.25-degree axis to the preserve of the campus, to penetrate into the campus. So this was the overall site strategy. The real strategy that we were really talking about was the whole notion of recontextualizing art. As you know, that, say, before the notion of museum, art was a context, both socially, politically, and symbolically, in context. Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, one of the primary examples of art in context. What happened was that art began to be collected and then taken out of its context, put into frames, and hung on walls of public buildings. And what has happened in the 20th century is that the museum has replaced the town hall in a way, and the library and the cathedral as the symbolic public building, at least in the American town. And each American town wants to have a museum. Now, what's interesting about painting is that painters and sculptors have wanted to move their buildings out of the frame, that is the frame of even though they would like to be in museums, they want to move out of the physical frame of the painting and off of the pedestal of the sculpture to recontextualize their work. Now, Richard Serra's Tilted Arc in New York City, the one that was moved recently, is an example of art trying to recontextualize itself in a new way. However, what it still does, while painters and sculptors want to recontextualize art, they still want architecture to act as the frame and the pedestal for their museum work. In other words, they don't want a decontextualized or a recontextualized condition for architecture in relationship to the museum. So that while painters like Jasper Johns and Rauschenberg very much, and Stella want to break down the convention, as well as Andy Warhol, to break down the convention of the notion of the framed, reified object, they very much want that frame to exist in the form of the architecture. What this architecture tries to do is to break down the relationship of architecture as a frame for painting. In other words, it makes it very difficult to hang traditional framed or pedestal sculpture or painting. And it's very much about an attitude toward art which talks about the notion of the event. That is, the art in the museum becomes recontextualized in the spaces themselves. And it becomes, in a sense, an eventual art, much more like performance art. And the whole idea of this project was to take another attitude about the relationship between architecture and art. And therefore we get performance spaces, mixed media spaces, spaces for laser art, computer art, everything but the traditional notion of the framed, reified object. And what I'm going to show you is a building that in itself is not a framed or reified object. It is a fragmented object in the sense that it is a different object. It isn't from the north. This is a picture of it from the north, and we're going to show a set of slides which is from the south. So that I'm going to show pairs of slides from the north and south, and to show them very quickly to show the fact that this is not a composed building in the traditional sense of the word. That is, it is very different from the north than it is in the south, and it extends this notion of a fragment, that is, a non-building throughout its being. It attempts to, these gray pieces here, which are new pieces of architecture, are made to look like they're part of the existing structure that is being occupied and enveloped or broken down by the new construction. Can I have the next two, please? Here's the axis of entry along from 15th Avenue. This is the high street of the town. You can see the angle of the street going right through to the building. This is the library, which is at the end of the oval. The axis, these two framing columns and these two framing columns, framed an axis here on the center line of the oval, and you'll see how we dealt with that axis. In other words, this axis came along here and then cranked into the town. It was a very unstable meeting place. And what we did was just to extend this axis into the campus. Next two, please. Here is the south end. This is the oval. As I said, this scaffolding, which will be eventually painted white like this, comes out and connects in an asymptotic relationship to this, the end of the oval. And here is a piece of a plinth. There are these plinths which break the level of the ground. It's another thing that we did was to break the horizontal surface of the ground. And here is a traditional semicircular niche which catches the axis. That thing is faded out of view on the left. There you go. And what you can see about this semicircular niche is, in fact, it is sloping down to the ground. It's got a series of seats on it, and these seats are sloping, and it's very difficult. We're having to redo the whole thing because these were precast seats, and to try and get this angle, nobody had ever, at least the guys out there, had never tried to do this before. A lot of what we're doing sometimes has to get redone because even though the drawings are accurate, they're not used to building strange slopes like this. Next two, please. These brick towers are the remnants of an old armory building that used to be on the site. They have been displaced from their and then fragmented. We've used the same brick that the old armory building was built out of, but allow the new construction, as it were, to penetrate through this old piece. So that what you get is a play between a piece of memory and a piece of the future. The scaffolding being a piece of the future and the armory brick pieces being a piece of the memory, and this interaction between the two. Next two, please. This end is merely this end is merely a just sheared end. It has to allow for big pieces of art to get in there, and so it has these big heavy doors, but it's essentially no end at all, as this end is no beginning, because this scaffolding penetrates beyond. So the traditional notions of entry, the signals of classical trappings of how you get in, and where there is the former entry. I think that's a little out of focus still right there. I wish I could clear it up. There you go. You can see the former entry is sunk down into this building and sheared off, so that the traditional trapping of symbolic entry has been eroded. Next two. It's, I think one has to really go and see this building. It doesn't I haven't got many photographs of the inside. I will say one thing that about it. Vince Scully went to see it, and Vince and I have never seen eye to eye about architecture, and he called me the day after he saw the building, and I was very surprised, and he said, Peter, you know, you and I have I've never really liked your work. And I said, no, Vince, that's true. And I said, just to make things equal, I've never really liked your work. And we got the methodological preliminaries out of the way. He said, you know, Oscar Wilde once said that to have an aesthetic experience, one had to suspend the intellect and the feeling. And he said, what I did, I went to see your building, and I suspended your intellect and my feeling. And I had a truly aesthetic experience. Now, I won't go on because Vince said he's had a revelation about an American architecture. I don't want to now be smarmy about Vince, but I think it's interesting that you don't need much theory to have an interesting physical experience in this building. I'm surprised myself, and I thought it was going to be much more of a theoretical experience, and it is a very sensual one, and I find that myself interesting. But being my first really large building, this is about 14,000 square meters, 140,000 square feet. It's very different than, say, even the Berlin building or some of the other projects we've done. Next two, please. Next two. What's also very interesting, I believe, about the project is the landscape elements. The way we spent a lot of time with material and landscape, the whole idea of the building as a series of landscape objects. And so that the edge of the building is never, there is no ever any edge. There's no frame to the building. There's no place where landscape begins and building ends. It just continues into the landscape, these fractured pieces of building. Next two. This is all a series of precast concrete pavers. This is grass here. This is probably, we made a mistake with this material as precast concrete because conceptually it didn't work, and what we're now doing is going to cover it probably with limestone. We realized we made a conceptual mistake. We told the university, and they didn't like the concrete either. And it was just something that, you know, when you're doing drawings that are very difficult and complex, you sometimes forget how to control the thing that you're working on. Next two, please. Here you can get some idea of these, this sloping piece. Unfortunately, all of this has had to be cut out because when they poured the frames, the underlayment of the poured concrete, and then precast the pieces, the thing, there was too much slippage, and then it just didn't come out. It really is a very strange thing to try and get. There's a double sloping curve on that, which is normally something which is level and takes the classical axis very. It's very interesting to be on that axis. I was reminded of this in Barcelona today, being on one of the chopped off corners of the Paseo de Gracia, and sitting and watching all the traffic go at a diagonal, which is essentially in a square grid because you're on enough of a corner chopped off to see the two roads as diagonal. What's interesting is when you sit here on this classical axis, you really feel very strange because you're sitting tilted on the axis. And you begin to realize all the other things in the building are tilted as well. Next two. There you can see those steps. And also these plinths in the back, these are made of German red sandstone, and they have prairie grasses, mounded dirt on them now, and these grasses will be up to about 4 feet high. So there's this incredible sense of this earth erupting, this piece erupting out of the ground. Again, there's a lot of theoretical talk we could go through, but I really want to go through the projects. The theoretical work, I think, is done on this. Next. There you can see what it's like to walk between these plinths and what the grasses are going to be like. They'll be, you know, up 4 feet. You get the sense of what that'll be like in the north end of the building. Next to. And always when you're seeing brick or plinth, you're always seeing this grid, this ever-present scaffolding grid, either in the form of a shadow or the form of a reality or a trace of the grid. You'll see it in this brick tower coming up soon. Next. Very strange thing walking under this is a very Albers-like effect. As you come under, you begin to see squares, and then because these things are coming down at you, as you penetrate through, walking from south to north, you continue to get a set of squares that come at you. Next, there's one of that set where it sort of stop frames and freeze frames at a point, and then you walk under it and you see another one. You feel like you're walking downhill. Next two, please. This is the inside, and again, the whole idea of the inside was to try and make a structure where you never knew that the skin or the thing that separated inside from outside was not monolithic, that you were always looking through to the grid, either inside or outside, and the protective shelter was merely a membrane which allowed for various passages of light, but also that the form could continue through. You could continue reading the form through that membrane. Next two, please. This is one of the towers. It's the first time you've seen this side of it. Here you can see the trace of a grid. In other words, it's the trace of a grid that might have been there when this tower was there. In other words, it's a fiction, the thought that yes, there were grids in those days as well, and when you rebuild the thing, you find that there was a trace in the tower. It's also a tower that is peeling apart. As you can see, there are 3 different layers of brick. We made a boo-boo on this one too, because this brick shouldn't have been the same color as this, and when we got there, it was specified wrong, and now we're going to have to correct it because the reading is wrong, and this color isn't quite, you know, you get into those things because theoretically is one thing, but then the building of theory, in order to make it come out right, you start to get into things which are physically real, and the thing doesn't read like it's peeling apart because we chose the wrong brick. Next 2, please. But that's what's called inexperience. It's theory, not that you can't build it and get the theoretical results that you want. It's just that not knowing. I can tell you, we picked the seats for the film theater out, and I looked at the material, I looked at it in natural light, never thought, because of my inexperience, to look at the thing in the light that was going to be in the theater. Of course, it would have been too late because the light to the theater got in after the seats were installed. But when the seats were installed inside and they turned on the lights, I said, these are pink. And we wanted a cool gray because there's layers of gray, another theoretical idea. And of course, they look more like a pink color. And I said, stop! I saw the first seat before they put it in. And of course, the next day I told the director of the museum to go look at it. And the next day he went, they were already nailed in, because what the contractor does, the minute they hear that you want to stop something, that's when they speed up at that particular area, because they don't want to stop anything. So the seats will be there, and if you didn't know it, you wouldn't know that it was the wrong color, because it would elude you, whatever the idea was for the color. Next 2, please. It only doesn't elude me. Now, obviously, as you can tell, this wall on the right in the gallery is going to be a very difficult wall to exhibit painting on, or traditional idea of what painting might be. And that was intentional. Next 2. But I'm trying to show these as the way they were conceptualized, playing against one another. The trace of this grid on the, and again, I'll show you something interesting the contractor got wrong. This thing is not supposed to be yawing out like this. It's supposed to go up straight. But they laid the bricks, they counted the bricks wrong, so this thing is not going up straight. It should be over here. And we're having a big fight about getting to straighten it out. So he's trying to trade something. We may trade and leave it like that, because again, you wouldn't know that it was a mistake, or no one would know it was a mistake. Next 2. You can see it there. You can also see what the light's like inside on the walls. Again, talking about recontextualizing the framed object. Next 2, please. We boo-booed the end of this. This should, that should have been a cut brick. All the cut places are not dematerialized, and we missed it. Next 2. But we tried a lot. I mean, I think we got a lot. We missed some things. This is the Guardiola House in southern Spain, outside of Cadiz. I'll tell you just briefly about it because it's a house which is, for me, very interesting. I had been working with Jacques Derrida on a project called Kora Works, which is a book that's going to be published, and hopefully a project that's going to be built in Paris, going to be published by the AA. And it was about an idea that Jacques had been working on called Kora, from the Platonic notion in the Timaeus. And of course, when Jacques and I worked together, we really didn't work together, and we pretended to be working. And it was only afterward that I got a notion of what he was talking about Kora. And it was something that I realized that I would like to try as a notion of a different kind of space. And one of the things that I've been working with is the notion that Euclidean space and the whole idea of Cartesian space and the Cartesian grid I no longer thought were acceptable for a way of dealing with the problems of contemporary topos. And we went back and looked at the notion of Kora. What Kora basically is, the only way I can describe it to you in physical terms, is if you put your foot in the sand and you take it away, you leave an imprint in the sand. And that's what I would call an imprint. But the sand also leaves a trace on your foot. And it's between the trace of the sand on your foot and the imprint of your foot in the sand is something which could be called Kora, even though Kora never takes the materiality of the what is known as the receptacle. The receptacle never leaves its being on any surface. It's very difficult to do that with architecture. In any case, I get a very strange call from a man who raises bulls by the name of Guardiola. He wins prizes in Seville each year, and he said he had a dream. And he said in the dream he was going to build a didactic house. And the next day, for some strange reason, there was an article in a Spanish newspaper about Peter Eisenman as being one of the most didactic architects in the world. He'd never heard of me before this. He probably didn't even know what the notion of didactic was. And he called me and he said, "I want you to build me a didactic house." Well, I get a lot of funny calls like that. And very strange calls. And in any case, I said, "Look, mister, send me a ticket, and I'm going on vacation." And sure enough, he sent me a ticket. We went down, and he said, "Do whatever you want." And I really wanted to work on this notion of Kora. So the house that I'm showing at 9H Gallery, and these are some of the drawings of an idea of the Kora. Now, what I did was to use a traditional form that I had used, a signature form. The L-shaped form was a signature form that I had worked on in many of my projects, and because I was trying a new kind of spatial deployment, I used the L as a convenient form. Next two, please. I think that the house, I think, is interesting theoretically, and probably a very interesting house to live in. We have some problems because it's right on the ocean, and I didn't give him any windows to look out on, and these kinds of things, but it's not what the house was about. I mean, it would have had windows if it could have, but theoretically it didn't work out that way. There are glass pieces, but they're on the floors and places. There's a glass floor, which is one of the, again, way of disturbing the notion of man's domination of the natural ground surface, where usually you stand upright and you look out of a window. Here you stand and don't look at anything, but you look at the glass floor as if it were the window. And here the floors are not level either, nor are the walls, and there's some problems about the question of why floors need to be level, and he asked questions like, what happens with the table? And I said, well, you can cut one of the legs, raise legs. There is an interesting thing which we've tested. It would be the notion of the bath is very interesting, because the bath is tilted, but of course the water comes out flat. And there is an interesting thing about, tilted baths and floors with water in it in a different way. Never mind. It's not part of the theory, but it is a very strange experience. We made a bathtub like this and filled it with water. Next two, please. these drawings show much better over at 9H. The slides are not that good. I think it'd be, and there's a small catalog they have over there, which I think explains the house in a very succinct way. And I think you have to, it's again a house, even though it started from a theoretical idea, something else emerged from it. And I think that's what interests me about it, something that I find quite indescribable. We have very large models that we work with, and the space is certainly different. And the reason why we knew we were onto something different, I think you're going to see this in the drawings that you see at 9H, we knew we were onto something because usually when you do construction documents and you draw a line that's 3 inches long at a certain scale, it stands for something in space that's 12 feet. But there are no lines in our drawings that are 3 inches long that stand for 12 feet because the paper, the plane of the paper is never in the same plane as the built plane of the reality. And so therefore there's always an angle difference, so that what you're looking at on the paper is something that's not the actual dimension. And if you ever want to sit down and try a set of working drawings which are not actual dimensions but approximations of dimensions with angles so that they're instructions to the builder with angles and station points, you'll see the drawings over at 9H. There's no question that the convention of drawing that we use, that is, because we use a flat sheet of paper, that we assume that the wall is going to be flat, and when the minute the wall is not just not flat, but it is off in 2 dimensions, or in 3 dimensions in some cases, it makes it very difficult to draw. And it'll probably be even more difficult to build. Next to. We're hoping this is going to start construction this fall. There you can see the glass floor. This is not a poorly made model. It's the way the pieces fit together. The imprinting and trace is it does try and describe itself, and you have to really sit down and look at it, but it's not something that we really designed at all. We took this thing and set it into motion. I don't know how that other thing got in there. That's a slide out of place. Sorry, I got one out of place. It's the next project I'm going to show you. But that house really is about the trace and imprint of this idea of a receptacle. I mean, an other kind of topos, another kind of space that architects could make. Next to, please. It's not about another image for a house. There's the structure, and we have a Barcelona engineer working on the structure. It's a very difficult structure to work out. It's all precast concrete. There are traces, which are beams in the actual space, which means you're ducking under things, and it's a different experience of what one would call occupation of space. It's certainly no longer habitation, that is the habit of living in space that we're accustomed to. Next two, please. Just briefly run through these. I guess, again, you'll get a chance to see them. Again, these are not, the drawings aren't wrong. It's the way the thing comes out. Next two. And it's not done just for the effect of something tilted. It has to do with this attitude about another kind of space. A very revealing, I think, section. Next two, please. Next. Next, please. Next. Here are the plans. The spaces will be interesting. Let me say that. I mean, it'll again be, I think, a very sensual house. But you'll definitely realize that it's not the traditional notion of the Western habitation. Next two. Next two. Just show you all the drawings. Okay, glad I'm on target. This is the second project in that series of working with Kora, but we were also working now with a larger scale building. This is the Carnegie Mellon Research Institute in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The president of Carnegie Mellon, I told him that we were working with Kora, and he said, fine. He said, but he wanted to say something very clearly to me, that he thought that the forefront of where science was that for 4 or 5 centuries, since the 15th century, modern science was about the struggle of man to overcome nature, that is, to rationalize the world of nature. And he said that he thought that we were no longer in that period of the struggle of man and nature. We were in the post-technological, post-rational, post-industrial world, all of those things coming out of the struggle of man and nature. He said we were now in an era of information, and that the struggle was between man and information, between systems of artificial intelligence, robots, clones, etc., and that he wanted us to do a building for him that, as architecture symbolized the struggle of man and nature, he would like to do a building that symbolized the struggle of man and knowledge. And what we did was, instead of starting with the traditional Euclidean cube, or some fundamental unit, that Cartesian unit that talked about Euclidean space, Cartesian space that is rational space, we took the unit of information systems, which is the Boolean cube. Now, the Boolean cube is an n cube. That means that at any intersection there are at least 3 chords of the same length at any one time. Now, 3n cube is the traditional Euclidean cube. The one that you're looking at there is a 5n cube, and the reason why it takes its shape is that the chords always have to be the same length, because information travels once it's blocked up in a computer. When it blocks up one channel, it's got to go down another channel, and the channel, in order, it has to be the same channel. In other words, it has to be these infinite repetitions. And so n means that they're the infinite repetitions at any one intersection. And what we did was to take as a new integer for architecture, as a symbolic integer, we took the n cube, the Boolean cube. And we then took that, working again with the idea of a new topos, that is a new place, grounded in the idea of Kora. And this is what came about. Next two, please. Now, what's interesting about this project, this is the site of the former Jones & Laughlin steel plant in Pittsburgh. And there are some towers and things very similar to, and old sheds very similar to that were there in the Ohio State project. And we used them again as remnants of the industrial era. Now, what's interesting about this line, again, a Cartesian line, when you cut it, the notion of line means that every segment in that line is always the same or is predictable. That is, it's either going to be A, or it's going to be A, B, C, D, E, F, G, or it's going to be A, B, excuse me, something like that. Here again, dealing with asymptotic curves and Boolean cubes, we made a line that at no one point was ever the same along, in other words, any cut section. You can imagine what it's like to draw sections of a building where it's never, ever the same. And we're doing working drawings right now in this building. It's going to start construction in October. We're starting with these 3 elements down here and 3 other elements down here, working toward the center of the project. Next two, please. Again, pictures of the early site model and site diagram. Next two. Oh, there's the slide that's out of place. There's the I knew I couldn't get it all right. That's the drawing I was looking for before. That probably doesn't matter if it's here. Next to, there is the roof plan of this Carnegie Mellon Research Institute, and the floor plans. I'm just going to run through those quickly. These are the sheds and the chimneys that were there. Again, part of the asymptotic deployment of these Boolean cubes. Next two, please. Next to. Next to. Just to show you, we do have all the plans. I mean, I think and then it's not necessary to go into all of it. Next to. End elevation in a larger scale model. Next to. Now, this is the thing I wanted to show you. What we worked at here was that usually when you talk about imprinting and tracing, that you're always thinking of something which is a void. Now, void, we're in a void space, and void is usually a, for me, or we traditionally think of it as a negative. I really believe that void is a positive, that void is as positive, and Kahn Rowe's done many figure ground studies to show that voids and solids are equally presences. What we were trying to do is work with the concept in Kora of absence, of a conceptual absence. And what happened is that in this particular project, in the imprinting and tracing of these two Boolean cubes, we came up with this form, which is the form of the absence of their intersection. And we treated them as solid rather than as void, so that we could demark them in a different kind of way. Now, what's interesting is this was not lost on. These are all highly eccentric forms and idiosyncratic. And somebody said, well, what are these things, right? And we couldn't go into the theoretical explanation, so suddenly somebody called them bananas. And we said to the president that these were bananas. And he became fascinated with these pieces, also knowing the theory of the work, and he presented them to the Board of Trustees, these bananas. And but he said, we don't have enough money. I have a choice of moving people into this building or building the bananas. And the president has chosen to build the bananas and not move anybody in until he can get enough money to outfit it. Now, I think that's really very exciting because it's a step forward. I mean, I think that he's more interested in the architecture than whether people can actually use the building or not. Obviously, he's making a very interesting ploy because they're not going to let the building sit there empty. And if they outfitted the building, he'd never get the bananas. So he's building the bananas first. He knows that somebody's not going to let the building sit there empty. It's not the nature of our society. In any case, we were very excited because this thing is again, it has some very strange pieces. I think the space is going to be quite stunning in a way. Next to, there's a drawing that I'm going to hopefully get to. There are the elevations. I'm hoping I'm going to get to the perspective drawing. Next to some sections which begin to show you the articulation, how these bananas start to grow in the space. Next to, there it is. There's the section, and again, there's no design involved in this. In other words, nobody's making an image. We didn't know what it was. We hardly could build the thing when we got to it and to draw it. But we're beginning to draw perspectives because the kind of space we're dealing with no longer can be just shown in terms of axonometric. That's Mies van der Rohe looking in bewilderment, I guess, at what's happened to modernism or rationality. But we, again, trying to do working drawings for this building is really a big problem, I can tell you. Because again, we're dealing with angles in places that are not have anything to do with the orthogonality of traditional lab buildings. Next two, please. Now, what's interesting about this is, these are not, the next two after this, please. Next two. You have to go to the next two. Sorry, I don't need it. Next. Okay. What happened was that one of the board of trustees of Carnegie Mellon University was a developer in Pittsburgh who said, holy God, and this is wild, said, I want one of these buildings too. I mean, it's like the world's gone nuts in a strange way. And we said, look, Mr. Lewis, we love you, and it's really nice you want to build one of these, but you can't afford this. And he said, no, no, I can afford it. I want to try it. I know that I can, that this is something that people are going to be very excited about. And he said, and I also want bananas. And we said, well, you know, developer floor plates, we know enough about doing developer buildings. And he said, no, and now each of them have, we've made them a little, all the people who sell space for this development company, it's the biggest development company in Pittsburgh, and they have an HOK building, which is what they occupy, which is what they formerly thought architecture. They now have these little Koras on their desk with these little bananas intersecting as totem images. And this is their building. Next two, please. These are, I mean, these facades, when I say facades, in quotes, are not really worked out. We've just, you know, we've been rushing like crazy to get this thing done. And we don't know what the skin is going to be like. We've got a person, we're working with a person dealing with how we do the skin. We know we want a certain kind of metallic intersection of different metals. We're not sure what it's going to be, and we know we don't want a certain kind of panel. Again, the problem of materiality is going to be very crucial to how these things actually exhibit their theory. Next two, please. So this is a model of this developer's building. And again, there's some strange intersections, as you can see, that come from the Kora intersections. Next two, please. It's not a question of we like the way it looks or we don't like the way it looks. It's not the issue that the image or the hand of the architect is not involved. In other words, there is an idea which is then worked through, and the author is no longer a controlling mechanism, which is another issue at work in these projects. Next two, please. The other side of that model. Next two. Okay, this is a project that no one's seen here, I guess. This is the recent project that we won for the Columbus Convention Center in Columbus, Ohio. It's a 750,000 square foot building, which is an enormous building, 75,000 square meters. It's a big public building. Again, if museums were the public buildings of the 20th century, I think convention centers are the public buildings of the 21st century. And I was reading Jean Baudrillard's book on America, talking about the notion that America was the primitive culture of the 21st century, and it was a culture of movement, very different than the axial movement of European cities, but it was a movement of the freeways, and that traditionally the freeway were always seen as the boundaries of the city, that is the framing elements of the city, and the detritus of the city. And what we did was to take the freeway elements and make them no longer the bounding frame, but the subject itself. And what you have here are a set of freeway pieces that we, in fact, took as the elements for the object. We wanted to break down the mass of the object. We were dealing with throughway and rail yards down in this section here, very small-scale buildings. As Alvin noted, it's a very contextual building because you see these very small-scale High Street. Again, it's 2 miles down from the Wexner Center. Now, the interesting thing, again, about a high-stakes competition, this time we were against Michael Graves and a former student of mine, Wes Jones, who could outdo me in terms of rationality. He'd worked on the Wexner Center. So we thought we got trapped between Michael on the right and Jones on the left and didn't give us much room to breathe. We knew we couldn't do a gridded structure. We couldn't do a palazzo, because again, we knew Michael would have the palazzo. And it's exactly what he did. He did the 3 pavilions in front, because there were 3 major halls. And so what we did was to jump out of the notion of the reticulated gridded form into a set of hollowed out vermiform, if you want, dealing with both movement and light, which is the basis of information. And these are basically cable forms, and try to somehow produce an object which fell out of both the rationality of, on the one hand, of Jones, the pavilions of Graves on the other hand, and also away from the idea of Kora. In other words, we tried something different, in other words, at a very large urban scale, to see if we could bring a new set of forms. And again, theoretically, I don't know where this project is. It's something we just won the competition. And what's interesting is the city council voted to build the damn thing. They've got $80 million. They love this. They don't think it's scary or spooky at all. I mean, I thought, in fact, people said they really wanted to touch the model. It was something that they needed to want to touch. It had a feeling of wanting to touch, which I think you could examine those responses to it. This thing is going into the ground in October. We have to finish the drawings by next January. And strangely enough, they're going to build. They don't want to change. They want to just like this. In fact, we were trying to rationalize it, which is my natural tendencies, and we made a model, I understand, last week, that we had a meeting, and they said, no, could we go back to this because it was more scary, which is interesting. Next two, please. And there's something about wanting to be frightened in some way that is afoot. There you can see the drawings that we did. These were with spray and Zipatone for the competition. It was a 3-month charrette, and again, I don't really understand. I'm just showing you the work. First time I've lectured or tried to show it. Next two, please. The plans. The thing works very well. That's what's interesting about it. We knew we had to win the competition to make it work well. So basically the thing works, which I think is one of the reasons why we won. There's a whole theoretical explanation, obviously, but I'm not convinced of it, so I'm not going to tell you about it. Next two. The diagrams to prove that it works. Next to the organization of the space. Next to now, in our presentation, these are the kind of, what was interesting about it, and the whole lecture I wanted to give about weak image is something I am working on, and I'm not going to talk about it tonight because it's not well enough formed in my mind. But because of the fact of the world of television that we live in, and that, as Baudrillard says, our dreams have become, the images have become our dreams. There's no longer a way to dream of something because we always have to have an image for it. We are a culture of images. And not just information, but information through images, logos. In other words, we have to reduce reductive, strong form. Now that leaves architecture in a very strange position because it can't outdo a logo, and yet what many people are doing is designing buildings to be taken as photographs rather than in real buildings. In other words, they design buildings now for the one great shot. In any case, people, while they looked at this thing, and the public voted on this, and the town of Columbus voted, and we won over 3-1 over Michael's project, which they felt was too patronizing in its imagery, which was interesting that the people of Columbus felt patronized by easy imagery. And again, an interesting commentary on the way the world is moving. But they kept saying, what is it? In other words, they wanted to know what it was. It wasn't enough that they liked it, but they had to have something to hold on to. So it's the first time I've ever given a presentation to a jury with 600 people in the jury where we showed parallel images like this so they could hold on to something, that it could be something. Next to, please, for them. And then these were very telling images which they could understand. The ends of the building, the facades, are basically fiber optic cables blown up at different scales. In other words, the end of what a fiber optic cable would look like at a cross-section blown up. That's merely what it is. Next to, please. Next to. Next to. Next to. Next to. By the way, the model, what's interesting about the model, I don't know if you noticed it, but we did the shadows in pink. It was like a solarized photograph. In other words, it's like the instant after an atom bomb, in a sudden explosion of light. And the whole background is gray with these solarized, like man-ray photographs, and then this kind of golden, bronzy thing kind of looming out of this solarized landscape. Next to. This is the most important part of what the presentation. What we did was to build a laser inside the model, and nobody knew we had done this. And then we were in this 3,000-seat auditorium, and we set it up so it could start to move in the space. In other words, not just like a discotheque, it looks like a discotheque here, but actually framing space. In other words, through fan-shaped use of the lasers. And suddenly, during the presentation, at the very end of the presentation, which was a 3-hour-long question and answer period, we said, okay, we'd like to show you what this convention center really can do. And we dimmed the house lights, and we started smoke going, and we had Philip Glass music pulsating, and this smoke going, and suddenly this thing, the model, came alive and started to zap. And the room that these people were in, the 600 people, was also like the model. It was like being in the convention center and the center in the city. And it was a very effective presentation. I don't have anything but these two slides which capture the essence of the performance, the event, that is, the thing that can no longer be physically maintained in time. And this is where the work is moving toward the notion of a weak image. And for me, the notion of the weak image is the image which is not a lasting image. In other words, part of it is a different kind of time that's involved. And again, that would be another lecture, the notion of the eventual time, or time of event, and as part of the notion of weak image. And it's a set of ideas that I'm working on now as a result of working on this project. Next two, please. the required perspectives next to. These things actually go in and break up. This is this concourse space. These forms come in and fracture the space of the concourse. So it's something that penetrates into the project itself. Next to. This is the last project I'm going to show you tonight, which deals with a similar kind of vermiform, as it were, but for a different kind of reason. It's a project for the new School of Architecture, Design, Art, Architecture, and Planning at the University of Cincinnati. And it's for this site here. This is the existing building. It's another approximately 130,000 square feet. It's the northwest end of a campus. And what's interesting is this chevron-shaped building and this hillside. And again, we were working with the notion of the frame as the object and the notion of the frame as the ornament and structure, and the play between ornament and structure. And we started that with Frankfurt, and we came now back to the notion of the ornament as the structure in this project. Can I have the next two? And again, I say that the theory is behind the actual work, but we were working with the chevron and the curves, the asymptotic curves, and you can see these vermiform shapes playing off against the chevron forms in the landscape. And I don't want to say much more about that. This is the first presentation, and we got enormously positive response. This is a project that, again, is twisting and turning on itself. The forms now twist so that the section in one side is this way, and in other words, sloping this way, and on the other end it rolls through itself, twisting out of itself and up into the ground. Into the ground and up out of the ground, this particular form. Next two, please. These are the parking level, entry level. I don't need to describe that to you because I wouldn't know how to explain it to you myself. I've never seen these, but I mean, that's what they sent me. Next to. But you can see the attempted intersection of the chevrons with these vermiform shapes, which again take and deny the notion of a single center. In other words, the arc is not a single arc, but a series of three arcs which come off of three different centers. Next two, please. There's a model. It's a very strange set of buildings on campus, but there you can see the object that we're making, which is both fragmented by the, imprinted by the chevron, and also is attempting to imprint the chevron form. It's still in very early stages, which we, but it's something that also is an earth form. In other words, it's a building that attempts to be low and not disturb this natural corner here. In fact, we're trying to, we've done away with the road that used to be in here to bring the whole natural landscape into here in some way, that the building becomes part of a series of landscape forms, but also tries to articulate and energize something with these supposedly framed, that is, traditionally framed cubic masses, to break down the notion of the building as a metaphysical enclosure, to break down this notion of what I've been calling metaphysical enclosure, which is part of this notion of the weak image. Next two. There you can see it, how it is eaten into by the chevron, and it also attempts to eat into the chevron form. next to, you can see the way it hooks. This thing is here at this end down here. I think it's tilting toward you, and then it tilts away in the landscape. So this section tilts up and away. In other words, it comes over itself. It's supposed to be a piece of hollowed out shell-like forms. They're vertebrate forms, as you can see. They're notched and vertebrate, but not like any kind of animal or anthropomorphic vertebrae that we know. It's a very different kind of vertebrate. Next to. Here you can see a picture of the space, the roof of that space is going to be like, and the different levels. This is looking up, this is looking down, and what that vertebrate notching does to the roof form. Next. There you can see another view on the left looking down, and a view across the space on the right. Now the lights, please. These are buildings that are all going to be built. They all have real budgets and real clients, real deadlines, and we're going to learn a lot about pushing the theoretical ideas. I think that I'm very excited about the practice because we're working at a scale where we're getting a chance to try out some really interesting urban ideas, landform ideas, as well as more intricate internal constellations, and then merely museums, which really are a very easy program, or a house, which in a sense is a very easy program. It's a program which is known. And these programs, I don't say much about them, but we do a lot of programming work. We spend a lot of time programming these things. They all work well, but they do not glorify the notion of working well. They do not symbolize the intention to work well. They merely work well, and they are about something else, and it's very clear that they are about something else. I don't want to say anything more about them. I hope that as these buildings come out of the ground, which they will start to do two of them this October, that I'll be able to come back in another year and show you some of these things as they develop. We are really pushing the limit of the kind of office I want to have and the kind of scale of work we're doing right now, because it's something that if we were to get another project right now, we really wouldn't theoretically have an idea of what to do. In other words, we're trying to sort through these things. As you can see, it's really working through the theoretical ideas into practical building and in practical sites and budgets. So something that I can't say much more about. I'm certain that maybe some of you will have questions. What I really wanted to show you is some of the questions that we're asking ourselves through the buildings that we're doing. Thanks very much.
Because of the opening at 9H, which is not far distant, perhaps there's about 10 or 15 minutes of discussion. Is that all right? Are there any questions? Anybody want to make a comment? Charles?
We have used computer-aided design, and we would love to be able to use computer-aided design. The problem is for us, as we found out with our Frankfurt project, which was developed on a computer, when we got into drawing it, we didn't have, it would have cost more time to program the computer to be able to draw the thing, and we could learn to draw it as the computer drew it. So What we've been finding is, like the working drawings for the Guardiola House, we would love to have done the working drawings for both the Guardiola House and the Carnegie Mellon Research Institute on a computer. The problem is the cost, the front-end cost. No one was willing to pay for the front-end cost of doing that. It would practically use up all of our working drawing budget. In other words, we would have zero something down. I mean, we'd be able to, yes, manipulate it and have a lot of control that we wouldn't have by doing it by hand. But as yet, our clients are unwilling to give us the kinds of budgets that you need to do the kind of work we're doing. Computer-aided design right now, I think, is a drafting service for big firms. It doesn't work in design and the kind of complexity that we're working with. In fact, I have a very good friend of mine at Ohio State, Chuck Suri, who has a Cray, which is one of the supercomputers, and he says, Peter, you would really have to be doing this stuff with us on the Cray. And he said to buy time on his Cray is so expensive that it would be prohibitive. And he said that the kinds of programs that are available for the kinds of office work that's being done now could never approximate the kind of work that you're trying to work with. So right now we're in a gray zone. I would love to be able to get one of the computer companies to be interested in the work we're doing, to give us not only some hardware but some software and some people to work with us, because I think we could do some very exciting things with computers. Yeah.
Is there any bridge that you could make or shed some light on about your ideas for scaling in the Romeo and Juliet project, and what you were working with and what you learned from the house in Spain? Because it seems that it brings up similar issues of confrontation with the site, confrontation with program, the aesthetic object, but it's worded differently.
That's, it's very interesting if you go back through the work, back through House 1, and the words, it's really interesting. The issues are the same, but the words change. Maybe it's my need to constantly reinvent a similar language. I think the issues that I'm addressing are the same. I find it very difficult to be my own analyst about the work. In other words, what the difference between Romeo and Juliet and the Guardiola House is. I know that the Guardiola House the work has come out of the ground now, and for a while the work was in the ground. I mean, the Berlin project, Ohio State project, Siena project, Long Beach project, in a sense, were projects that were in the ground. So they've come out of the ground psychologically, I know that. Then they've come out of the ground in a different way than they were out of the ground before. In other words, they treat the ground differently. And I think the Guardiola House treats the ground a lot differently than House 10 did, for example, which was the last house that was out of the ground. So I don't want to say anything more than that. I'm really much too involved in the work to step back right now and say anything cogent about what it is or how you would relate this to that. I can't do it as well as I used to be able to do it. In other words, I used to build my own rational network of ideas, and what I try to show you tonight is probably as much as I know about these projects. I can't say any much more than that about relationships between this and that. There are certain ideas that come out of the work that I did with Jacques Derrida and reading the things but I mean, I was reading or misreading Jacques Derrida before I even picked up a book of his, you see. So, I mean, it's very easy to say that the ideas in Truth in Painting have influenced the work, but there's no question they have, as many other writings. When I was reading Michel Foucault or reading Chomsky, there was always somebody who was reading that stimulated, or what I would call reading. And it's very interesting for Jacques to see the work. We had a seminar, Jacques and Hillis Miller and myself, 2 weeks ago, and it was a very interesting experience for him to see the new projects as a result of the kind of thinking. And what's interesting is that his students began to say to him, how has his intersection with architecture pushed him from where he was? Because it was very clear to them how my intersection with him has pushed me. So I think that there are some interesting issues that are raised by the movement in the project, but I for one, am not really able to comment anymore. Yeah.
Can you possibly comment on the theoretical aspect of the presentation for the tunnel shape, where in Vincent you mentioned explosion, nuclear explosion, and shades and pink and gray background.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, what we tried to do was to say, what we were trying to do is to make an object that talked about the world of light, and the world of energy, and the world of form as coming from light, and that is where information is. And we tried to make a model, that is, models are very symbolic objects, and how you paint them, what you do. We took what would be a solarized photograph. In other words, what we wanted to do is have a photograph that was not quite about natural shadows or about natural light. It was an instant, it was a kind of freeze frame, and talking about this notion of a different kind of time. We were working with a non-narrative notion of time, that is what I call time of event, or the time of another term I'm working with is paratopos, which I didn't use tonight, but it's an interesting idea, another kind of attitude toward topos. We were trying to work in the model not as a narrative notion of time, but as this notion of a freeze frame, that is the solarized, where in the development process of a photograph, you allow a flash of light to hit it, and then it takes on a different way of being. And what we did was to make a model as if a flash of light hit it at a certain time in its development. That's all I can say. If you were to see the model, you'd understand, because the model has built-in shadows on it. The buildings are different color. They're cast as if they were from a photograph, right? And the casting is so that the shadows on the ground are of the color that the buildings used to be. That is, the buildings were pink, right? Now the buildings are gray and the shadows are pink, okay? And there was, I can't explain it any more than that. It's quite an interesting effect when you see the damn model, I can tell you.
It sounds very interesting. I was curious to find out more about the actual theory behind it.
But so all it was this notion of working with a different kind of time, and the time of event. That is, the object as symbolizing a different kind of time. Basta. Any other, yeah?
When the last house in Spain was much more massive than some of the earlier houses you did years ago,
Yeah.
where it was very light. Is there a movement?
I'm trying to get away from the grid. I mean, I'm working away purposely from the notion of the grid as the base form, right? And working more with this penetration and imprinting and tracing of surface. Okay? The Ohio State project for me is a very old project because it is a gridded project. I mean, I find it very predictable in a certain kind of way. And the new spaces we're trying to work out of and away from gridded space as the articulating element. Yeah.
You mentioned the word form a lot. You mentioned the word theory a lot. You haven't talked much about people.
Well, let me ask you, could you come on more with that?
The people who will be out in the space, how people will be.
Well, let me ask you as an artist, how can I'm not a sociologist, so I mean, I don't know much about, I mean, I am a human being myself, and I don't know what would you want me to, give me something give me an example of something that I could say that make me feel better, and then I'll see if I can say it. I mean, you know what I mean? Say something. No, who says I'm supposed to come? I presented myself as I wanted to present it. You're telling me I should come over. Give me an example so I can understand your question.
Are these buildings supposed to be inhabited by people?
Yes, they are inhabited by people.
And so, what is their feeling for it? What is it?
Well, I tried to talk about the fact, I said something about that, I said that I'm against habitation, which is the notion of habit, that is, people using things in a way which doesn't confront any of their normal expectations about the physical environment. That I was talking about the transition from habitation to occupation, and that the notion of the relationship of the human to user to the building was that one of occupation as opposed to habitation. And you use the word, how would they inhabit? I'm not interested in inhabiting. I'm interested in occupation. So there's a very big difference between what you were interested in and I am. I'm interested in shaking out the notion because I believe that if we continue to inhabit and use the same dialectical terms for what space is, we're going to have the same hierarchical problems that we've had in society for a long time. I think we have to reinvestigate, and I don't want to get into now a broader theoretical issue, but the whole notion of the relationship of the individual. First of all, these are not anthropomorphic, they're not anthropocentric, they're not man-centered, they're not about man, they do not symbolize the notion of the individual as the centric force. They are displaced objects in that sense. But that doesn't mean they can't be used. They are used very well, and they can be, they function very well. They don't symbolize this attitude. In other words, they don't make it dominant the traditional notion of the relationship of architecture to the individual user.
Peter,
Yeah.
if you go back to some of the things you used to say 10 years ago when you were reading Foucault, and it's still in what you're saying to a degree, you talked about, as Foucault does, a new relationship to artifacts in the object world.
Another relation, I should say. I shouldn't say
Sorry.
new.
Well, no, but your language is shot through with
New. I
the
don't mean
new and the modern. Anyway, be that as it may.
probably my fault.
No, tonight you were emphasizing the new and getting away from habit, you know.
Get away from habit, right? But that doesn't mean
no. But you kept saying it's interesting, it's sensual, like a modernist. Anyway, so, but you know, one of the funny things.
I'm not going to fit into one of those boxes you want to put in. Go ahead.
No, I want you to fit into your own box.
Yeah, go ahead.
The disappearance of the author,
Yeah.
and the disappearance of the center, and the disappearance of the subject, and the end of the anthropocentric view, for Foucault, and it appears for you, or no, more for you, I don't know about Foucault, but for you, funnily enough, comes back to a very strong authorship. But instead of it being you, the author, it is the idea or the theory that's the author. And the theory is a kind of deus ex machina. I mean, in other words, it drives you, it justifies you. It can even lead to a conflict with the client, with changing the slope of something. I mean, it's as if there's a terror now, instead of the auteur, or the author, or the individual, or you, is the terror of your theory, which terrorizes you and you use to terrorize the client. What do you think?
I think it used to be much more simple and hierarchical. It's never so simple anymore for me, Charles. It is part of what you say. The author never fully disappears. Anthropomorphism never fully disappears. In other words, it's never so complete. It's very much more it's weaker. In other words, it's never it's not as certain as it used to be. It's fraught with a lot of much more, and it's, if you want, I mean, I would love to compare it to a different reading of complexity and contradiction. In other words, if you take, it is very much more about complexity and contradiction without the hierarchical notions and the classical structure that still permeates the Venturi theory. It's a different notion of complexity and contradiction. Okay. Thank you very much.